Jones. I'm a board member for the Society of Professional Journalists. I am also a consumer and investigative producer with NBC7 here in town. And I wanted to start us off by showing you guys a satirical illustration that Matt Hall had showed me. This was published in the 1894 edition of Puck magazine. And it was part of a larger illustration talking about poor journalism, shoddy journalism, and it reminded me that when it comes to misinformation or distrust in journalism, these aren't new problems. But the new variables that we're dealing with here in 2017 is social media use and outside influences, trying to manipulate public opinion with this distrust in journalism. So anyways, I think the conversation tonight will hit some of those points, and we'll be able to recognize some of those signs moving forward. So let's start off. What is fake news? I can't answer that question in one sentence or two. The definitions, the meanings of fake news change depending on who you're talking to. But First Draft through Harvard University came up with this scale, and what you're seeing is a scale of misinformation on the left to disinformation on the right, and everything in between. So I wanted to start off by asking Matt. Matt, how would you describe fake news?
Great question. I think we should all go to #HumbugNews based on that drawing from Puck magazine. I think fake news the answer is different depending on who's asking the question and who's given the answer. But generally, this is a pretty good chart, I think, to start from. Fake news basically does range from misinformation to disinformation. And so it can start with bad journalism, which is journalism that doesn't include all of the right voices or all the voices or doesn't have context, to journalism that has some mistakes in it, to, on the far end, on the other end, weaponized news, which is a news story that maybe someone disagrees with politically or thinks that they can score points on by disparaging it or calling it into question. This is a great week for this panel because you have the biggest story in America right now is Roy Moore's Senate race in Alabama, where, as you all know, the Washington Post had a story detailing allegations from 4 women that went into great detail on decades-old claims, and his supporters, the Breitbart Newses of the world, are castigating the reporting. And so they're just focusing less on the story and the allegations and more on knocking down the Washington Post. And so I think we're seeing in real time the definition of fake news kind of get a workout.
Right. And then Rachel Moran, you in your research, you're looking at focus groups and surveys. How would you say a member of the public defines fake news? Do they know what they're talking about when they use those words?
I think Matt said it really well in that it depends who you're talking to, and it's also quite platform specific as well. So when people are talking about print news, they generally are talking about the claims made, say, by the president, calling into question the credibility of the news source. But when they're talking about online sources, they kind of come into question this more disinformation. So it's maybe foreign bodies who put in news stories into social media that have become viral. So the meaning is really kind of changing depending on the platform, depending on where it's coming from and who's using it.
Right. It's funny, when I was preparing for this, anytime I brought up the words fake news to my friends or family, it would automatically go to a place of being for President Trump or against President Trump. Is this, Rachel Laing, is this more of, did the Trump administration create this political talking point?
So I was just recalling during the Bush era, there was real fake news in the Daily Show, and they used to always say that they were fake news, and everybody knew them to be satire and parody. And I feel like that Trump took that, turned it around, and is now, basically taking it, beaming it back at the liberal folks who and saying, basically falsely saying that all news is fake if he doesn't agree with it, and it's so the definition has changed significantly.
Right, that makes sense. Okay, so as we just kind of said, there's a lot of aspects when you're talking about fake news. So first, I kind of want to talk about if you look on the right side, the fabricated content or disinformation. And I figured I'd use a local example. So a week ago today, the Chicago Times News had this post on Facebook. Big news for San Diego. Amazon choosing its second headquarters for here in the city. And this was being shared around, and if you actually clicked on it and read the article, you'd see, okay, this looks like a real article. It even had a quote from Jim Bezos himself saying, San Diego has the space for this second headquarters. And it's not until you scroll down to the Chicago Times News' About section, you would see Chicago Times News, the most trusted news source for people who completely lack fact-checking skills or sound intuition. So I bring up this example to say, Matt, what are some of the things that journalists and members of the public can look out for when it comes to determining if an article is real or fake?
That's an increasingly important question, I think, and I think it's a question that not only journalists need to answer themselves, but we need to do a better job of kind of teaching media literacy, both to readers, but also to younger generation, future readers, right? I'm talking about middle school kids or even primary school kids. And that's a pretty good example. I had that on my Facebook page last week. Some pretty smart, tech-savvy people were sharing that and saying, oh my God, this is awesome. Well, yes, it's true. But so I think one of the things, that's a great example, is there such a thing as the Chicago Times News.com? Well, if you don't know, you can probably Google ChicagoTimesNews.com. There's a Chicago Sun-Times, but looking at the URL is very important. There's a lot of ways to kind of cloak a fake website using the country of Colombia, I think. So it's like abcnews.com.co. Those countries are based there, and if you didn't know, they kind of mirror what ABC News or some other site would look like. So if you don't check the URL for starters, you could get into trouble. Also knowing what the story says. If this is the only news outlet reporting that story, if you haven't heard of the news outlet, it's probably not true. So check not only the brand, but you can Google that. You can check your friends and other digital spaces. Also important, there are whole industries now. Snopes, based in here in San Diego, PolitiFact, which is one of Pulitzer Prize, whole websites devoted to fact-checking this information. So there's a lot of ways to do it. If you want to drill down, another good way to check in social media, like an image, right? Google Images allows you to upload a picture very quickly to its website and check and see if it's a verifiable thing. As a journalist, this is super important, because every time there's a major snowstorm in Chicago, the same picture of Iceland like 10 years ago surfaces. And oh my God, did you see Chicago today? Well, no, but that picture is actually not from Chicago, right? So there's tricks that you can do, and if you don't know, ask. Don't be afraid to ask someone before you share it. Which brings me to my quickest point you can do is don't share something you haven't clicked through and read. I mean, that's a pretty good tip.
People do that all the time. They see the headline, they like what they're seeing, and they say, yeah, let's share that. And pretty soon it's like lightning around the whole entire internet before anybody's even clicked through.
Rachel Moran, in your studies, do people typically look into an article before they hit share?
The short answer is no, not at all, and that's one of the ways that social media has really changed the game for journalism. It used to be that you would at least have to kind of glance through an article or half listen to a news story before you talk to your friends about it, but now you can just share it without even a thought, and that verification, that validation that you give it to your network of people is one of the most dangerous things in kind of promoting it as being true.
Right. I wanted to bring up, you might have seen BuzzFeed did a data analysis last year looking at the top 20 real news stories and fake news stories and social media engagement for the 2016 presidential election. For me, as a journalist, this is kind of disturbing. Rachel Laing, how would you say that fake news impacts the average person?
the worst part about fake news, the most dangerous thing, is that it undermines the credibility of all media, right? So eventually, and this is very deliberate, right? You undermine it and people start to doubt, and the more the doubt builds, the more they distrust everything. And then eventually you have control over people by having the media out of the picture as a arbiter of truth, basically.
Right, right. Matt, is there any mistakes or anything that we could have learned from this last presidential election as far as journalism goes to combat these results? I mean,
that's pretty staggering to see that chart right there. But look, Rachel said it well. It comes down to trust and credibility, and once you lose that as an individual journalist, as an outlet, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to get it back. But there was a lot of energy, speaking of this election, put into the election on fact-checking in real time. You had major news outlets invest more money and staffing power in fact-checking the 3 debates, in particular, the presidential stage, and to a lesser extent, the vice presidential forum, than you had ever had. And did it matter? Well, Trump lied a ton. Hillary lied a lot, or at least less than Trump did, right? So you had a couple people who are not very well versed in the truth, or inclined to tell a fishtail, and people chose. It'll be interesting to see. I don't think the sample size is big enough to know whether this will repeat itself in 2020. But if I'm managing a newsroom in 2020, I would not spend a lot of time, real-time, fact-checking during debates. I think you need to approach it maybe more methodically, so maybe have, climate change, what the candidates get right or wrong with climate change. But I think that now, in a very real way, people don't even agree on what the facts are. And I think that's a problem. I don't know how you kind of combat that, but that's something that we as an industry, as a society, need to kind of figure out and get back to square one pretty quickly.
right. Rachel Moran, one of the focuses of your research is fact-checking, and does it work? I mean, can you elaborate on it? Does it?
The current research on fact-checking is really mixed, and it seems that it's not really pervasive enough to be a good counter to this misinformation. Research that came out this year suggested that 1 in 4 Americans saw a fake news story, and of those Americans that saw it, none of them actually saw a fact-checking piece that would counter it. So it's not really pervasive enough for us to know for sure whether it works. What we also know is that partisanship is a huge implicating factor in whether people will accept the truth of a fact check or not, and less ideologically convinced people will be more open to accept fact checking, but your more kind of right-leaning ideologues, people who generally have a distrust in the media, do not accept fact checking at all. So it's pretty much lost on them at this point.
You might have seen last month, this was reported by the New York Times, the Italian government is actually launching a pilot project to teach media literacy in high schools. How to detect fake news. It says here among them, thou shalt not share unverified news. Some of the things that students are being taught now in high school. Matt, when we talk about media literacy, what are we talking about?
That's a good question too. I think that definition has expanded. I think it needs to expand to combat fake news. But it used to be that media literacy was telling someone the difference between a news story and an editorial, or an op-ed. Different types of writing that you might find, or storytelling that you might see or hear. Now I think media literacy, a big part of it is telling people how to, as we just walked through, how to tell fake news from real news. I often say that we spend all this time and pull our hair out, those of us who have hair, to talk about what fake news is, defining fake news, and the spectrum of fake news. If we can disagree on what real news is, like that, if we just kind of flip how we're framing this whole discussion, and we can tell people this is real, then maybe there's a lost generation, but maybe students get older and they can start to vote, and they'll have an intuitive understanding. Actually, I don't want to draw on too much, but I saw an interesting NPR story. I heard an interesting NPR story just last week about kids they understand this fake news world that is kind of new to some of us in a very real way. They have two Instagram accounts, a Rinsta and a Finsta. They have a real Instagram account, right, that they use for their parents to see. Wow, I'm telling you something you don't know. And they have a Finsta, like their fake accounts for just their friend that no one knows about, you know what I mean? And so they are intuitively understanding that there is real and fake elements of the digital space, right? And so I think those kids are more receptive. Those kids aren't going to be fooled by the ways many were by fake news. You know, if someone sees a headline that says Pope endorses Trump, maybe they will know that the Pope isn't in that kind of business.
Right. Rachel Laing, do you think that we need policy changes here in the U.S. to bring about to kind of like what the Italian government's doing?
Well, I've never thought that the government should get involved in helping determine what's real and what's fake and what's, you know, good reporting and bad reporting. But after watching the last elections in Germany, and you know, where was it that they basically did it was France. They have a media blackout 3 days before so that people can't drop that surprise story. I'm thinking like that's not a terrible idea, but I do think it comes down to education, and you know, it's incumbent on all of us as professionals and people in elected office to really emphasize and put an emphasis on credibility in the information that we provide. And you know, if you want to call out news that you don't like as fake, you're digging your own grave 10 years down the road when you need arbiters of truth and you need trustworthy media. And I hope that what we're going to learn is that what people will learn is that this is going to affect them down the road too. And that, you know, when you weaponize that, when you take a true story and call it fake just because it's not to your liking, that ultimately it's going to destroy society. You know?
Right. Rachel Moran, you've actually been looking into policy, researching policy changes. What are some, in your research, what are the kinds of policy changes that you're looking into?
Well, obviously education policy and trying to instill some media literacy into education at many different levels, but we're also looking into policy changes to make platforms accept the fact that they're now media content producers and not just content curators. And that has a lot of ramifications in terms of elections, in terms of how the Federal Election Commission can come down on platforms who maybe aren't promoting enough transparency as to where their content is coming from, and then kind of hiding behind either algorithms or content curation styles in order to protect themselves. So we're looking for policy changes that really make platforms like Facebook and Twitter accept the fact that they are now media producers as well.
Right. And just to piggyback on that, it's interesting to see, was it last week or 2 weeks ago,
right,
that Facebook and Twitter and Google testified before Congress on this very issue. And who did they send? It wasn't the CEOs of the company, it was their lawyers or their legal experts. They are pretty resistant to that. I think that's going to be a pretty difficult battle. I don't know where I am personally on that issue, but one thing that you clearly can regulate is ads on social media sites. We should treat them the same way that we treat ads on television or the radio or the newspaper, where we know how much is being spent, what the buy is, you know, the details of that purchase, and we have no idea what those companies are doing. And I think that's one simple way that hopefully the companies, certainly most Americans, I think at this point now, after this past election, would agree is a pretty smart place to start, at least.
And if they're smart, they'll do it voluntarily, and they'll find ways to identify if something's coming from another country, if something's coming from, you know, some, you know, ways that they can mark and identify and tell people, like this, you know, red flag on the news, for instance.
Right. Shifting gears more towards the weaponizing of the words fake news. Matt brought it up, the Roy Moore reporting in the Washington Post, and you know, this was a woman who claimed that when she was a teenager, she was sexually assaulted by the Senate candidate for Alabama, Roy Moore. Other women came forward saying Moore had tried to date them, asked them out. And I bring this up more so to look at the piece of reporting, because the reporters did a really clear job of explaining what they knew, what they don't know, and basically all the facts that they had, and they had corroborated the women's interviews with other women who had been told about these claims back in the late 70s. Roy Moore's response, this garbage is the very definition of fake news. So again, this is an example of real reporting, but using the fake news term. Matt, how often are you seeing that tactic being used as far as, oh, that's just fake news?
I don't know if it's being used more. I think the term is being used more, but when I covered City Hall during the pension scandal, I heard a lot, oh, that's not right, or there's the UT going again. You know, it's a long-standing political technique to deflect from bad news coverage. But you are hearing the term more. And the most fascinating, there's many fascinating things about that Washington Post story. One of them is the lengths to which they described how they got the story. That's something you would not have seen in a newspaper story 5 years ago, probably 2 years ago. They talked about how they were the ones who approached the women individually and through several interviews got this story that they presented. You know, and now you have their attackers using the term fake news. Breitbart is even like shaming the Post, vilifying the Post for persuading these women to tell their stories. You know, it's all a framing. I guess they persuaded that, you can see that as a negative, or you can see it as the Post did, which is they went to these women, tracked down the stories, and had them share that story. I think a bigger issue at play here that you'll see in journalism a lot with the truncation and the shrinkage of the industry is that reporters get criticized a lot for being from two silos, right? New York and LA, most of the reporters are in those two cities. No one's paying attention to the flyover part of the country, to all these places, smaller places. South Bay, for example, is kind of like this news oasis we have here. There's always parts of the country that get short shrift. And here you have a case of Washington Post reporters spending weeks in a part of the country that was ignored before the election, and now they're being vilified for it. You know, so I think people are going to criticize the media. They're going to find something to criticize the media about, and I think that's, as journalists, as PR folks, as researchers, that's just part of our life now. We need to, as readers, we need to realize that that's part of it. So we need to insulate ourselves. That's clearly what the Post was doing by saying, here's how we got the story, in a way that, you know, is kind of not, which wouldn't have been considered.
Yeah, that level of transparency was unusual, and it really bolstered the story's credibility. And I think you'll see from the reaction to it by, you know, GOP senators, and I mean, maybe it's true that they kind of wanted Roy Moore out of the picture, but it was so credible. It was so hard to refute. The manner in which they got the story, the types of checking that they did, they checked, you know, what these women's registration was. You know, they were all registered GOP. They all said they voted for Trump. It's that sort of thing where they really backed up everything to show that you know, this isn't a witch hunt. This wasn't something that was given to us by Oppo Research. This was hard, like shoe leather reporting that led, and we followed some string, and we got the story.
Do you think the weaponizing of the fake news term, from a PR standpoint, I mean, is that a tactic that works?
1600 Pennsylvania Avenue gives you all the proof on that.
It works on a certain segment of population that are inclined to already believe that. If I tried to bust that out just because I didn't like the story that somebody did in the UT, I would never try that. I would be embarrassed in front of my colleagues and laughed at for trying to suggest that something that was actually true that they reported. Now, I will take issue, you know, any day of the week with the way something is characterized, whether I think that they made something more of a set of facts, even if the facts are correct, that there's a pattern of, you know, the way that they put them together to insinuate something that actually wasn't accurate. I'll take issue with that, but I make very clear that, you know, these facts are correct, but the suggestion that you're making was not.
Makes sense.
And that's fair.
Yeah, I think so. Rachel Moran, in your research, does it say anything about this tactic? Does it work? I mean, on public trust?
Yeah, it does. And as you said, it tends to work on people who are more inclined to believe it. We're very closed off cognitively to accept things that are counter to our partisanship. It's also quite terrifying because it tends to work on people who haven't quite made their minds up. because it's this useful heuristic for decision making. We're in a very information-rich society. We have very little time, so we look for these heuristics to aid in our decision making. And now we have a useful, quite sticky term of fake news that it's a real easy thing to believe, as a shortcut, so we don't have to look into the facts.
And also looking internally, I mean, I think any claim that's going to register with someone has a kernel of truth to it. I think journalists have, for decades, done a terrible job of, as I said earlier, explaining the difference between an editorial and a newspaper story. Some people can blame the consumer for that, but I say we could have done a better job of explaining that difference. And also, I think journalists, look, no one likes to be called out for making a mistake, so I think largely journalists as a collective, not pointing fingers at any specific journalists, didn't admit they made mistakes, so they didn't correct it in a quick enough way or as fully as they could have. Now with my team, if we make a mistake, we're going to correct it, we're going to tell you on social media, with a correction in the paper, and a correction prominently placed online. And I think that level of transparency is kind of helpful to combat some of the fake news, but I think more of it earlier would have made people disbelieve that the media is out to get them, because the reality is that the media is for the public. Like, we are literally here trying to shine a light on things when done right and done well for y'all, right? Like, that's what the media does.
Right. We have in the audience members of the public here who might not know that journalists have a code of ethics that we live by, we report by. Matt, do you mind kind of explaining a little bit about what a reporter's code of ethics are?
And actually, I think all you guys have or should have this. I handed it out earlier. This is the SPJ's Code of Ethics. SPJ is the Society of Professional Journalists. There's a San Diego chapter. I'm on the national board. And by a factor of probably 10 or 15, every month, the most popular page on our website, on the national website, is our Code of Ethics. The second most popular page on our website is the backup material that shores up that Code of Ethics, whether it's case law or anecdotes. And it's at the foundation of what we do. It doesn't mean that if you break these rules, we're going to send the journalism police out after you. But it means that if you follow them, you're kind of, you're part of a club that takes its calling very seriously. The first part of our Code of Ethics is seek the truth and report it. Those are two separate things, right? You seek the truth, you look for the truth, you try to find the truth and uncover it. Talk to people who may not want to tell you the truth because they're scared, because they are a victim, or because it's a wrong, they don't tell you what they did. And then you got to record it. You have to figure out a way to get it in the paper, or the radio station, or the TV station, or collectively the singularity that we're all building towards. The second plank is to minimize harm, which falls into the reported category. Now, we're not just slapdashing things together because we know that people can sue us. Libel is a word that journalists know because they're fearful of it. If they take a misstep against a public figure, they can get sued. Which is why when you hear Lloyd Moore say he's going to sue the Washington Post, he can try, he probably won't win. The same way that Donald Trump said he would sue the New York Times during the campaign, and lo and behold, here we are a year later.
Truth is an absolute defense, so that makes it kind of hard.
Right? So the ethics code it's kind of like the force that binds us all together, right? And as you'll see on the handouts you have, it walks through the steps that we take, and we're always updating it, we're always reflecting on ways to handle situations that are difficult better. Like with victims now, in the last 5 years, there's been a movement to handle that maybe more carefully. So you don't name the victims, but there are other ways to get at that story and just handle difficult stories in a way that kind of is transparent, to use the word we talked about earlier, but also gets as much of the story out in as safe and importantly, accurate way as you can.
Right, if you're using an anonymous source, for instance, why are they anonymous? What is their fear that allowed you or let you let them be anonymous? And usually they'll tell you, spoke on the condition of anonymity because of, they're not supposed to be talking for the administration or something like that.
Right. Rachel, how often do you see violations of this code of ethics here in San Diego amongst reporting?
Do I have to? Actually, I'll be honest. I find the San Diego journalists to be a pretty ethical bunch, and I'll tell you one of the reasons I think that's the case is because of our harsh Twitter world, where you're not just, it used to be back when I was a journalist, before social media, you put out your story and, their only recourse was a letter to the editor, right? And the facts were already out there. But now you have some recourse in that you can take to Twitter and dispute. But I don't think that I think there's a lot of stories that have false insinuations or trumped up, pardon my French, no pun intended, trumped up insinuations. But I don't find people violating the ethics that often, actually, at all.
Rachel Moran, do you think members of the public know that we have a code of ethics that journalists report by?
I don't think it's well. I don't think it's well known. I think it's assumed that journalists and then have an editorial code that they obviously go by. But in terms of media literacy, this should be one of the big things that people are talking about.
Okay, so the latest Gallup polling that came out in August showed that when it comes to America's trust in the media to report fairly and accurately, it kind of splits by party line. Matt, what can reporters and journalists do to be trusted by those of all parties?
It's a great question. And it's funny, it's gone, there's so many polls on this subject. The one that I like to talk about is from Politico a month ago that goes beyond, do they have their facts straight? The question was, do you think that the journalists fabricate, so like consciously make stuff up, news stories? And 46% of people answering that poll said yes. So that's one out of half. That's half. 1 out of 2, which is amazing. So to your question, I think we need to be transparent in everything we do. I think the facts, the research bears out that this is helpful, and you see more journalists doing this. It's easier in the digital space to have your byline linked to your bio, which includes where you went to school, for example. So if you went to school at Columbia, that's something. If you went to school at journalism school X, that's something. If you say you went to school at some made-up university, which has gotten some politicians and others in trouble, that's something too, right? And that's one small example. You can also have links to your stories, right, which where it gets attribution and a way to get more information very quickly to a story. You can share your story transparently, honestly. You can be, importantly, receptive to criticism. I think too often, as I said earlier, journalists aren't receptive to criticism. They don't want to feed the trolls, or they don't want to answer someone, some random egg on Twitter. Yes, they're not eggs. Did they change? So you can engage. I engage all my critics. I'm, I guess, an anomaly. I'm on social media. I'm on Twitter from 5 a.m. to 1 a.m. So I'm having a panic attack that I don't have my phone in my hand right now.
Somebody might be out there criticizing you now.
But I think by engaging people and listening to them, really listening to them, maybe they said you did it wrong or you looked at it wrong. It's when I run the opinion page, so it's easier for me to say, I will listen to your view, I will share your view. If you say something that I disagree with still, I'll give you the courtesy of hearing you out, and then I'll explain to you my point of view. And I think that kind of back and forth, I don't think the way to save journalism is by individual one-on-one relationships with each reader or listener or viewer. But I think that does go a long way collectively, especially on social media, to building that trust and credibility, because it not only has the power of enforcing a one-to-one relationship, but everyone else who's looking at your feed sees that you take it seriously, you will listen to critics, you will change your editorial point of view if they are persuasive.
So Rachel Laing, you have a great perspective because you were a former journalist. Now you're kind of on the outside looking in.
Right.
Do you have anything to add as far as what journalists could do?
Well, linking to source documents and information where people can go and, don't believe me, go research it yourself, and here are some resources. I think that's really actually pretty helpful. When I'm putting together a pitch, like an investigative pitch for a reporter, if I'm I want a reporter to take up a big story, I don't just say, hey, this is happening, go check it out. I diligently put together all the documents that they would need and where they can find them so that they can go check it out for themselves. And the same thing goes, what he said about engaging people. It makes such a difference if you are able to answer to people who have questions and criticism over your reporting. And you know, oftentimes I really have seen the diligence of reporting fall significantly, and I think that's a lot because of the pressures of the newsroom now are different than they were. There used to be such a level of review and so many editors and copy editors who would catch little things, and bring it back up to the editor, and there used to just be such a cushion to make sure that everybody got it right. And now there's not that, and there's also, you know, this pressure to be productive that makes people continue on with the story that they've already, when it reaches a dead end, they push ahead anyway. That's pretty frustrating, and that's something that, you know, I would like to see people be more responsive to criticisms, and it tends to be, to me, the people who are the least diligent or who have the most insinuating stories are the least responsive when they're called out on them.
Makes sense. Rachel Moran, you've been looking into measuring trust. And is there a way to measure a news outlet's trust? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Traditionally, we look more at things like credibility. So what Matt was talking about in terms of individual credibility of the writer, but also credibility of the producer as well as the platform that it's being put on. But now we're trying to move more into trying to disentangle what trust means to people and the effect that it has. So how does trust implicate people's political decision making? How does it affect what they share with their friends and how they talk about things with other people? So a lot of these polls, whilst they're very useful in telling us like aggregate statistics of a decline in trust, they don't really tell us what that really means for people in how they're learning about things and how they're using that information. So that's what we're trying to uncover.
And trust, how do you measure trust? Like, what goes into that? I mean, what would you consider trust? I mean, what would be the measurement?
That's what I'm trying to figure out. But a lot of it is trying to disentangle trust of an individual story, the person that wrote it, what source it's come from, and the kind of political and partisanship around that source, as well as on the kind of perception side of things, like what factors implicate who trusts things more and who trusts things less. So there's a lot of different factors involved, and unfortunately it's not particularly easy to measure, so we're trying to figure that out.
Makes sense. Hopefully we'll get it. Okay, I wanted to open it up to the audience for questions. Really appreciate it. Yes, sir. Oh, we have a mic. It's coming your way right here in the front.
Fox News has been out for over 20 years, and they've been laying the groundwork for people, for their viewers, to believe nothing else but what they say. How much has that contributed to this current state of affairs, and how has the elimination of the fairness doctrine, or the fairness rule, also destroyed trust in media?
What do you mean by the fairness doctrine?
The fairness doctrine, eliminated in the 80s, it required stations to present responsible and opposing viewpoints.
I'll go first. I think, I'm not sure you can pin it all on the doorstep of Fox. I think CNN had Crossfire, and MSNBC has been on the left for a long time. And Fox has Chris Wallace, who's a pretty good journalist. That said, the point you make is a strong one, and I think you've seen it kind of move from television to other platforms, to newspapers, to the internet particularly. And I mentioned earlier Breitbart versus the Washington Post. You have a whole cottage industry of real and fake news sites that are going after the Times, the New York Times, the Washington Post. And my favorite response to that is from Marty Baron, the editor of the Washington Post, who says, "We're not at war with the new administration, we're at work." And I think that responds to anyone who says that there's kind of partisanship. There is partisanship out there in news sources, and the fairness doctrine has something to do with that, right? But I think it's on each individual journalist and outlet to find what Rachel was talking about. It's kind of like X and Y axis of neutrality and quality. And if you're high in quality and in the middle of neutrality, I think you're going to be trusted more.
Makes sense. Oh yeah, of course.
On the topic, you spoke earlier about Facebook and other such sources. They may be required to state who paid for an ad or this and that. I know that PR firms will pay people to write opinion pieces for the newspaper. Should they also have a little, this is paid content, something like that as well?
In addition to the sponsor, maybe logo, like actually disclosing who is behind the
Yes, because currently there is no disclosure. It's just an opinion piece by this writer, and this writer may be, paid by Southwest Strategies, for example.
Right.
Sponsorship identification is actually a really interesting area of research, and it seems that a lot of the research is saying it's not enough just to put that this is paid advertisement or this content has been paid by, and then a simple name like a PR company, because most people won't know that PR company or be a generic PAC name in the case of politics, and it won't actually help people disentangle like what actually that source is. So there's calls now to get the FEC and the FCC to require social media platforms and to require online news sites to have a more kind of hefty disclaimer, or have a hyperlink to a hefty disclaimer that would tell you exactly who it is that's paid for it, not just a generic PAC name, in order to try and combat some of that misinformation.
And that's in the process of being approved by the FCC?
Probably not under this FCC. The RGPI is a little bit hostile to it, and it has to also happen in the FEC as well, but there's huge sort of pressure to be doing that for about 5 years now, if not longer.
Interesting.
And just, I don't know if you want to weigh in too, but just because you're talking about opinion pieces, which obviously is my ball of wax, I think people know that some people have PR firms, ghostwriters that do that for them. Is there a way to zero that out? I don't know. I don't know that it should. I mean, politicians have staffs who write their speeches for them. Should they not be allowed to do that? Do you only let the mayor, not their staffers, to make kind of communications with the public? I don't know. But I will say that we go to great lengths to make sure only two requirements we have for op-eds are that it be a certain word length and that it be exclusive to the UT. So that's how we kind of try to curb some of what you're getting at. We don't want to have astroturfed, kind of mass-produced op-eds that will appear in 5 or 6 or 12 outlets. We want it to be specific to the Union-Tribune.
This is just a follow-up to your answer to this young man here. Rory Devine from NBC. You made me think of this, Matt, because you talked about Fox and also MSNBC and CNN also have some responsibility in all of this. Made me think, and I'd love to hear your input, made me think of media literacy, telling the people the difference between an op-ed and a news piece. I tell people when they're talking about, oh, MSNBC, and I can't watch CNN. I say, well, you have to know what you're watching. This is a cable news show. You're watching Chris Matthews. He's going to come from a particular perspective. You're watching CNN. You're watching Don Lemon. He has a particular perspective. So I think that's also part of the news literacy that we need to tell people about, because my friends were like, really? I said, well, I expect fair, balanced news on NBC7. No, I expect fair, balanced news on NBC Nightly News or on ABC or on even a GMA in the morning or something. But I differentiate those with the cable news. I don't know if that's correct, but that made me think of it when you said and I don't know that Fox, I understand your question. I kind of take them out of the exceptional
news definition.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think you see it with social media. People follow reporters from outlets X, Y, and Z, not necessarily outlets X, Y, and Z. And so I think younger folks kind of just do that by their nature. But I definitely think what you said is true. I mean, there are different levels of information sharing.
But know what you're watching.
Correct.
Know what you're watching, know what you're reading. Read both sides.
Yeah.
Find something else.
You can lie to people just by not covering a story. I mean, if there's a massive, the Roy Moore story when it came out, Fox News didn't cover it for, days, that kind of thing. I don't know if that's actually true, but I don't know if it was days. I think they might have gotten, I mean, they really didn't cover, when all these big Russia stories break, you look and it's like, Hillary, uranium, So in that way, a lot of people who watch Fox News only watch Fox News, and they're isolated from other sources. And if it didn't, if it doesn't, promote Trump's agenda, then they're not running with it. And so you wouldn't even know that he's doing the things that he's doing. You're never going to get any solid coverage on the ins and outs of the tax plan. So it's dangerous. I think it's quite dangerous, and I think it's actually undermined journalism significantly. I think it's a scourge, to be honest.
And just real quick too, I think one of the difficulties with news consuming now is that it used to be you sat in front of your radio, or you watched your one TV station, or you read your one newspaper, and that's how you got your news. Nowadays, you should read people from both sides. You should understand that in this day and age, people's biases and influences seep into their coverage, or are consciously a part of their coverage, which is why it confused me and kind of made me mad when Bret Stephens got such hate. The New York Times went out and got like a Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist from the right and added him to their opinion pages, and it's like, oh my God, how dare they? Wow, like that's a bad thing to have more people sharing information and looking at things in a different way.
Just in addition to what the gentleman had raised regarding sources, New York Times has reported that there are experts, many in academia, who are being paid to publish articles in noted publications, which in some instances are half-truths and some no truth at all. Well, the industry has to do something to, for disclosure purposes, even if it is an expert coming from, again, noted publications that should know better. What is the industry doing to bring disclosure that would bring, this sort of thing to light?
To be more transparent about
Right.
it.
Thank you.
It was a New York Times article.
The Coca-Cola Corporation.
Uh-huh.
The Coca-Cola Corporation
Right.
reported in the New York Times, hired a noted nutritionist.
Right.
He published a paper in a noted nutritional
Right.
publication that said that America's health and obesity problems
right, yep.
weren't due to what they were drinking and eating, Coca-Cola products, but they weren't getting enough exercise.
Right.
Well, in all the articles I've read over the years, you need both healthy food and exercise. Thank you.
I think that's actually fake research. I think that was, no, literally it was. They pay for the research, they pay for, they give them a grant, and lo and behold, they seem to find the most favorable thing to the funder. I mean, Monsanto's pretty notorious for that, for shutting down news on
What's the department doing to bring out full disclosure when sources are named, be they experts, who paid them? That's what needs to happen in order to get, because it's just a lot of money out there, this community of experts.
Yeah. You raised a good point. I think journalists need to do a better job of explaining their sources, like to what Rachel's point was earlier of sharing your sources, linking to your sources. So I think we need to do a better job of reporting our sources and teaching consumers how to know a good study from a bad study. Polls is only one example of this issue, right? People said, oh, the polls got it wrong. If you actually look at the 2016 election, the polls were pretty accurate. You got to look into the detail, the national polls, thank you. You got to look at the details of, what was being assessed, the margin of error, et cetera, et cetera. And I think too often we think people just understand polls are, or we're too lazy to explain to readers that polls are a snapshot in time, and so I think that's one example, studies being another, where journalists just need to kind of do a better job of showing people what is accurate and not.
Yeah, anytime you're reporting on any study, there ought to be who paid for it. That should just, if they won't tell you who paid for it, then don't report on it. Would be my recommendation.
Yeah, makes sense. Any other questions?
Hi, thanks for speaking today. I was wondering if you guys knew off the top of your head maybe the names of some popular websites that are notorious for producing fake news.
Breitbart's in the news a lot. Yeah, and that's one that springs to mind. During the Northern California fires, there was a famous example, famous from a month ago, that said the Northern California wildfires that have devastated, thousands of homes and killed whatever it was, 10 scores of people. There was an arrest in those fires, an immigrant. And actually what happened was a guy left a park with like a leaf, a very, very small fire, and was arrested. And yes, he was an immigrant who had been deported and come back, but he had nothing to do with those wildfires. So that's the case of your context getting the story wrong. And now Breitbart has kind of gone on full attack mode with the Post. And you can even read, there was a Breitbart story post, I think yesterday, that said, it was about, I forget if it was about Moore or something else, but they said, it was about Moore. Moore told, Breitbart learned in a news conference, Breitbart learned in an event that Moore had hosted that was closed to the press. So in there, Breitbart is admitting that it's not press in that sentence, right? So I don't want to just ding Breitbart. There are other examples.
Pretty notorious, though.
But they are the biggest one, obviously, because Steve Bannon had
InfoWars
with Alex Jones. Yeah, InfoWars is also terrible.
Felt like a lot popped up during the election, and then some article was published. I can't remember where, they had a list of a lot of them. Did you get that impression that maybe a lot of these websites started popping up during the election?
I did. I'm from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. That's where I was born and lived there till I was 12. And Russia was targeting Pennsylvania. So a lot of the people that I'm friends with on Facebook, I noticed them sharing these really dastardly stories about Hillary and, the FBI agent that
Suicide.
Yeah, there's the supposed suicide, and there's the Seth Rich story, which the man was in fact murdered, or he was murdered, but there was this whole conspiracy theory that it was Hillary Clinton, and I saw a lot of these people sharing those stories, and it's now evident to me in retrospect, oh yeah, they were targeting Pennsylvania, it makes a lot of sense, but I was looking at these and I'm like, you idiots, these aren't legitimate news organizations, why are you sharing this, why are you, and I knew that Hillary, but they believed it because they wanted to believe it.
And there were so many that kind of popped up that weren't even really pretending to be news producers, but news aggregators. So you click on them and you just get a kind of random feed of information, some of it which is nonsense, some of which is posing to be news. And they come and go so quickly that there's no way to kind of keep track of a particular source. It's just that people don't necessarily click through. It's just that the social media version and the thing that you see on your news feed was attention grabbing in itself.
Yeah, I don't know if this is a new term, but I certainly heard it during the election. I hadn't heard it before. It's like propaganda, but profitganda, right? It's like people who made stuff up out of whole cloth just to make money. And a lot of those folks, if you look, the LA Times had features on some of the folks who had these really anti-Clinton stories. They weren't Trump supporters. They were Clinton supporters who just wanted to make a buck. So.
And they were literally making up stories. Probably not seeing the devastation they were wreaking.
As this lady said, thank you for being here tonight. My question is, you mentioned how meticulously sourced and documented the process was that the Washington Post used in the Moore accusers. Describe the differences between how the Trump accusers were covered last year.
I did read all of the coverage of that, and I don't think that they did the background to see, okay, how are they registered? They didn't describe how they came upon these stories. They didn't do the background to see, are these people registered to vote? Did they register with a partisan affiliation? I mean, that does give a lot of credibility to these women. But in that case as well, I don't think there was a lot of disbelief of those women. I think people didn't care, and that's just as bad. They were adults, and I saw so many people posting things like, well, you're in a nightclub, what do you expect, that sort of thing. And that's a depressing fact of it. I didn't hear a lot of reports that people didn't believe the women.
There's also a different type of stories. I'm remembering that was the New York Times story that first broke.
I mean, his own words. He said it. He's there on camera saying that he basically assaults women.
Yeah, and it was, let's be honest, it was a different time. It was only a year ago. But everything that's happened since Harvey Weinstein, in reality, everything that's happened, this is a game changer. This is the biggest story of not just this year, but, you know, it's a huge story societally, right? You have the Capitol hearings today, you have Sacramento having to deal with this, you have the media industry, you have all sorts of work environments where this is just unacceptable. And the Moore story is a little different because it was teenage girls and he was a 30-year-old man, so that is distasteful to, if not everyone, a lot of people. Probably shouldn't be distasteful, not enough people. But that's a good question, you know?
Do you have any sources that do fact-checking as a profession, like organizations that do nothing but fact-checking, that we can actually trust and go to?
I would definitely advocate for factcheck.org. It's a project that comes out of the University of Pennsylvania Annenberg School by a well-known political communications scholar, Catherine Hall Jameson, and she started the project simply for it to be that, to be a no-holds-barred fact-checking outlet that fact-checks all year round and not just in election seasons. And I think that that's what's important. It's not enough to fact-check, as Matt said earlier, just an election, just a presidential debate, because there's no grounding of fact for people to actually believe what they're saying at that very time. So I would definitely advocate for them.
Thank you.
So we see younger generations turning to satirical shows like The Daily Show, Last Week Tonight, and even SNL for their news. This is mainly because they see that those outlets offer information in like a comedic or like a blunt way. Why do you think that is, and do you think there's any benefit in offering the information in like any comedic or just kind of like a front form?
Yeah, I actually have two reporters who do a blog called The Conversation for me, and they tell news of the day in interesting, entertaining, often funny ways, and the headlines are different than the headlines you might see in our news pages. They tend to be very well-trafficked stories. If you look at the Washington Post website on any given day, you'll see that their headlines have totally changed from 2 years ago, and they are more web-friendly and designed to kind of do what you're talking about. Maybe not be funny, but to tap into like a digital sensibility and get people to click through. There's a great video, if you guys Google, who did it? Al Jazeera did this video on headline making. It's about a 7-minute long video, and they talk about the history of headline making, how in the 40s when Hitler was killed, it was Hitler dead, Hitler killed, and when Osama bin Laden died, decades later, it was, we got the bastard and rot in hell. Right? Now those headlines are totally different. They're not quite, again, comedy, but it's the same kind of sensibility where, you know, The Daily Show, Jon Stewart tapped into something, you know, and if he had stuck it out in this last election, it might have gone a little different, in all honesty, because he was such a foundational presence, I think, for a lot of people. But I think with journalism, they're different. Those aren't journalists, because they are making jokes first and then sharing the news second. I think if we do that, we need to share the news first and crack jokes second.
What kind of advice would you give to those of us who have close family members and friends who are really into conspiracy theories and actually look at those of us who are younger and maybe not as educated as they are, and they're trying to tell us that we're crazy or we just don't know what we're talking about because we haven't been around long enough. And I find myself in a lot of these conversations, and they're really disheartening, and I can't seem to get it across, and it's sad. So I'm just wondering what advice you would give, especially when they're so die hard, like not willing to even look at the facts. What do we do?
fight? I would say just, it might be painful or aggravating, but just listen to them. If they're family, if they're friends, if they really are family or friends, then having a conversation would be the best thing you can do. Speaking personally, my family, we had a huge Facebook fight over the election. A lot of defriending going on, and it's just now starting to kind of come around. People take it passionately. And this was not conspiracy theory stuff. This was just kind of straight election stuff. I mean, it's good that people are that passionate, but if your family can't have a conversation, then this country is doomed, and maybe it already is doomed. Maybe the middle can't hold. But I do think just listening to them, and then maybe pointing out the fatal flaws of their arguments in a nice way, you know what I mean?
Or maybe asking them questions that forces them to reason is probably the best. That's what I do with my kids.
Sounds like we all have friends or friends of friends that may be in an echo chamber. So it does say here that you suggest that we check our biases, which is of course easier said than done. What would your recommendations be to have a diversified media diet?
What was the question?
How would you diversify your media diet to make sure that you're getting a full scope and not just confirming your own personal biases?
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually, so I go to colleges and groups a lot, and I have this slide of a slideshow. Then I'm SD Uncovered on Twitter. If you hit me on Twitter, if you hit me on Twitter, or matthew.hall@sdunion-tribune.com, I will send this to you. It's a slide that shows, as I was talking earlier, neutrality and quality, and it shows on that spectrum most of the news outlets on the right and left, and you can choose your diet that way, right? So in the middle you have like AP, The Economist, Reuters, and as you move to the left you have like NPR, NBC, pretty close to the middle, and like Vox, pretty far to the left. On the right you have like Reason magazine, close to the center, and then like InfoWars, which we all disparage, like way to the right, and then like the Journal or the New York Times are like at the top, and InfoWars on the bottom. So I think it's just knowing what to do, and if you are on Twitter, follow voices on the right and left. Like my Twitter feed, I try not to I try to be cognizant of the fact that I don't want to be in a bubble. So that's why I kind of vilify people who hated on Brett Stevens. The guy's really smart. You can challenge him like philosophically or intellectually, but don't like just set him aside because he's like on this side of the aisle. I think that's just ludicrous. So there's all sorts of op-ed columns, syndicated columns too. I just saw, where did I see this? I think the Washington Post is really going to great lengths now. They just started this thing where at the end of an op-ed, they'll say for another view, check here. Not necessarily the other view, like we don't live in a kind of polar society, but for another view, click through, and then you'll see what someone else said about this tax reform or housing. So it takes a lot of effort, but I'm glad you asked that question, because it's a very smart thing to do, to want to do.
I would say as well, we tend to think that social media is making us worse in terms of our echo chambers, but actually could be a really useful tool for you to see things that you wouldn't usually others see. So definitely follow people on Twitter that make you angry, because they're going to post things that you wouldn't have otherwise read, and don't defriend people on Facebook who post things that make you angry, because they're the people who are going to make you read the weird conspiracies that you would otherwise not see and therefore not have to reason with.
I'm a layperson, I'm a musician, and so I'm here just to bone interest. And it sounds like the only advice you have for us is to just take the time to find out if it's real or not. And not everyone's got the time for that. It's not everyone's job to read this stuff all day. What is the profession doing from content beyond just including links at the bottom? Like, how else are you going to show me that it's well sourced? Like, what kind of web content sort of thing? Is that an avenue you guys are looking at? Can we expect changes there, or is it still pretty much you got the paper and you got some websites?
No, I think we kind of go over some of the ground. There's always room for improvement, but having a byline that links to your bio, having a story that links to source documents,
yes,
that links to other outlets. If you're getting a newspaper story just blasted on a website, they're someone who doesn't understand digital journalism today. But if you are getting someone with a lot of links, not only on your site, but off your site to other outlets, I mean, that's what the industry, each individual journalist has to do. They have to own their beat. And that doesn't just mean share their stuff. It means share other respected outlet stuff. And debunking, as we talked about here, other things. So if someone says something that so your beat is housing, outlet X says something that is false on housing, you share it and you show how it's false. And then it's, kind of gradual increase in faith and trust and credibility for that individual journalist and that outlet. It's not going to happen overnight. I agree with you.
It sounds like you're describing a market for like curated like news aggregation, right?
Mm-hmm.
I would subscription the hell out of that.
Yeah.
But I don't know of that. Like I can pick this one paper and I can say, okay, I trust this paper, so most of the stuff I read over there, I'm gonna agree with it. But they're not covering every story, So I feel like there's some void there where it's kind of bringing it together. Because the news aggregation sites that are available, trash.
Yeah, the young woman over there asking about the media, diversifying your media diet. It sounds like, I was thinking, gosh, that's a product. If you could put together an aggregation of various perspectives that are all high quality, but that give you a diverse viewpoint, that would be really probably pretty valuable to a lot of people.
And also what to watch on Netflix tonight, right?
Yeah.
That's great. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for coming tonight. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
So just FYI folks, if you have parked in the garage downstairs, you will get 2 hours free with validation. The validating machine is the red kiosk in the lobby. Keep in mind that the library is currently closed, so please do not go wandering into the aisles looking for the latest bestsellers. Please do so.